Who are you, really? Or better yet, what are you? And which aspects of you matter? Could a mind uploaded into a computer ever be identical to the original person? How do you preserve your identity over time? Could it keep existing after you're dead? What does it mean to preserve the identity of a human consciousness? What does it mean to be you?
It's time for you to look inward and begin asking yourself the big questions. Who are you? And what do you want?
The question of identity has plagued Western thought ever since Heraclitus first asked if one could ever step in the same river twice. And today, we're still asking if you can. There have been many answers to this question throughout history. The body theory of identity says that your true self is just your biological processes. The mind theory of identity argues that the body doesn't matter, and the real you lies in your mind, or soul. The consciousness theory of identity says that your identity lies in the continuity of your memories. The bundle theory suggests that identity lies in our thoughts, as well as the grouping or association between those thoughts. The causality theory of identity argues that your identity lies in the psychological continuity of one thought causing another. The narrative theory of identity argues that our identity emerges from language. The haxiety theory of identity argues that existence comes before essence, and identity is really just your potentiality, the sum total of all the things you're capable of. First, we have the body theory, or somatic theory of identity, pioneered by Plutarch, who formulated the interesting thought experiment called the ship of Theseus. The Greek hero Theseus, who supposedly founded the city of Athens, had a legendary ship which the Athenians managed to maintain for hundreds of years since his death. However, during these many centuries, some planks on that ship would eventually rot and had to be replaced one by one. It's guaranteed that every plank on that ship has been replaced at least once. So if none of the planks belong to the original ship, then is it still the same ship? Well, the body theory of identity might suppose that it is. At first glance, all there really is to identity is just continuous existence. So as long as your biological processes continue, you still have an identity. When Darth Vader cuts off Luke's arm, we don't say that Luke is dead. In fact, even if Darth Vader turned him into a stump, he'd still be Luke. So the big question is, at what degree of bodily amputation do you start becoming a different person? Is it after you lose a couple cells? Well, what if you lose more than half your cells? Would you still be you? What if you replaced every organ in your body with nanobots, cell by cell? Nanobots equivalent in both form and function. To answer these kinds of questions, body theorists evoke an idea called animalism, which says that identity is not defined by the type of matter, but by the processes that direct that matter. Animalism says that you persist only as long as the homeostatic conditions that keep your body alive persist. Conditions such as metabolism, circulation, and respiration. The body theory also rejects all these airy-fairy ideas about living on through your work, living through the memories of your loved ones, or living on through your culture. Under body theory, if your body ever stops being active, then that's it. Your identity is permanently gone. Immortalists like Aubrey de Grey are good examples of body theorists. As Woody Allen famously said, "I don't want to live on in my work. I want to live on in my apartment." According to body theorists, the only way to truly live forever is either to reverse aging through nanotechnology, or keep transplanting each individual organ using biotechnology. But that latter idea has three really big problems. The first problem is that there is actually one organ in the body for which it's better to be a transplant donor than a transplant recipient. And that organ is the brain. I can easily say I got a heart transplant, a liver transplant, or a kidney transplant, but I would never say I got a brain transplant. Instead, I'd say that my brain got a body transplant. And this intuitively reveals the contradictions inherent within body theory. Philosopher Bernard Williams asks you to consider that you were kidnapped by an evil scientist who swaps your brain out with somebody else's and then lets you choose which body he's going to torture. Would you have him torture your own body, or the body you swapped into? I think we all know the answer. We know the mind is important because it houses your beliefs, desires, fears, ambitions, and goals. Your memories and personality don't come from your body, they come from your brain. So there must be more to identity than just your body. The second big problem with body theory is that the ship of Theseus doesn't really apply to humans. While our bodies do replace their stomach lining every few days, and our skin cells every few weeks, there is one group of cells that never get changed up: the neurons. However, what if you replaced each neuron in your brain with an artificial neuron, such that your brain functionality was preserved? What if tiny microscopic robots that travel through the bloodstream can go up to your brain, engage with the cortex, and switch out your neurons one by one? Would your brain then become Theseus's ship? This is a famous idea called the Moravec transfer, and it's probably the strongest argument for the preservation of identity, because it actually allows us to conceive of ourselves as becoming machines, one step at a time. But this brings us to the third problem. What if you created a replica of Theseus's ship? How then would you tell them apart from one another? If you use the Moravec transfer to make multiple copies of your brain, then which copy would be you? If that's the case, then clearly there's some aspects of your identity which aren't as interchangeable as neurons. Which brings us to the idea of a mind, or soul. The mind, or soul theory of identity, was pioneered by the philosopher Plato and adopted by major religions like Christianity and Islam 500 years later. Plato was the first to argue that our identity is not material, because we have the capacity to understand immaterial things, like numbers, geometric shapes, and abstract concepts like justice. Therefore, there must be some part of the human body that's also immaterial, assuming that only immaterial things can access immaterial things. It's an interesting speculation, but the philosopher René Descartes wondered how you'd reconcile a material thing like a body with an immaterial thing like the soul or mind. This is called the mind-body problem, and Descartes dedicated his whole life to solving it. Before the Renaissance, we used to think of a person's identity as their soul. But as the mind-body problem suggests, there's two major issues with this idea of a mind or soul. One, you can't verify it, and two, you can't distinguish any individual soul from any other soul. How would you identify which material body belongs to which immaterial soul if souls have no material properties? What specific property does a soul have that makes it yours, so to speak? For example, if your significant other came home from work today and acted just as they normally would, you'd have no way of knowing whether their soul was replaced with somebody else's, because things like memory and personality are still located in the material brain. After all, your intentions, beliefs, desires, memories, and experiences are the only things necessary to define you. There's no need for anything else. If every aspect of our mind has a corresponding location in the brain, then why exactly would we need some immaterial soul to account for our identity? If you have no way of actually verifying which soul belongs to which body, then what gives you the authority to claim that souls even exist at all? The philosopher John Locke famously argued against Plato and Descartes, suggesting that every day God could destroy your soul at midnight and replace it with another, but you wouldn't be able to know if he was doing this. If I went to sleep and woke up tomorrow, I'd have no way to tell for sure if I had the same soul, so why even bother postulating its existence? If it has no effect on consciousness, and no effect on the human brain, then it might as well be equivalent to just not existing. And whenever religions try to sell you an afterlife based on the soul, then it's no more comforting than just telling you that your middle finger will exist after you're dead. You have just as little reason to care about the immortality of your soul as you do to care about the immortality of your middle finger. So maybe there's more to identity than we previously thought.
But every religion says there's a soul part. Why would they lie? What would they have to gain?
I don't hear scrubbing.
After centuries of human history, we still don't have any evidence for the existence of the soul. So during the Renaissance, the conception of identity dramatically shifted to a new source: our consciousness. This brings us to the next big theory of identity, the memory theory, or consciousness theory, founded by Renaissance philosopher John Locke. Locke discovered this idea by looking into our legal systems and how they allocate punishment. If someone could remember having committed a crime and recall participating in that act, then they must be conscious of it and therefore responsible for it. So clearly, it's the act of remembering who you are and what you did that gives you your identity as a person. So if you couldn't remember committing a crime, then Locke said you shouldn't be punished for it, because at the time, you were quite literally a different person. If the body, soul, and mind can't explain who we are, then maybe it has something to do with the continuity of our memories. As long as you don't live in some postmodern cyberpunk future where memories can be erased, implanted, or traded, then this theory is pretty good for creating a functional society. Likewise, if you want to save yourself from death, just upload your consciousness and memories to a computer. Unfortunately though, it's not that simple, because there are two really big problems with memory theory. The first problem is that we don't really seem to recognize diseases like Alzheimer's or amnesia as somehow destroying someone's identity. Your father may have dementia, but he's still your father. And likewise, people with amnesia aren't dead to us, so identity doesn't really seem to depend on memory. The second problem is that memories aren't really reliable, and most of the time, we can't remember an event exactly the way it occurred. So how exactly are memories a stable category for identity? If the memories we have don't match up to reality, then why even bother trying to preserve them? What exactly makes you think that you're the same person you were when you were a child, if you can't even remember your childhood? In response to these objections, Locke redefined the theory as less of a static collection of memories and more as a continuous chain of awareness. While you can't recall all your memories, you still have memories of yourself at different points, each memory connected to the one before it, which is what Locke believed gives us conscious experience. For example, I don't remember myself as a child, but I do remember myself as a teenager, and that teenager does remember me as a child. So for all intents and purposes, I am that child, because the continuous chain of awareness wasn't actually broken. So yes, what we call the self does change at every moment. As long as an uploaded mind remembers who it was before it was uploaded, then according to Locke, your consciousness would still be intact. Furthermore, Locke also makes a distinction between a person and a human being. Because in order to be the same human being, all we need to do is keep our mind, body, and soul. However, to be the same person, we need the same continuity of consciousness. To this very day, we still have trouble locating things like consciousness and memory in the brain, though not for lack of trying. Neuroscientists like Giulio Tononi have proposed an idea called integrated information theory, which describes consciousness as just the sum feedback loops between the particles of our brain. For example, the cerebellum, which is the tiny brain located at the back of our brains, has 4 times as many neurons as the neocortex, but that doesn't mean it's more conscious. The neurons in the neocortex might be fewer in number, but they're more connected to each other. They're more integrated, and are thus more complex mathematically. But still, this isn't really a perfect theory. If we claim that things like consciousness and memory are equal to the integrated information of a system, then that description is still limited to a given time period. It seems kind of post hoc to stipulate that neural activity measured over 5 milliseconds is somehow literally our consciousness, when in reality, our conscious experience actually shifts throughout the day. Overall, Locke makes one fatal assumption with his theory of identity, because just as a person operates perfectly fine without the existence of the soul, they also operate perfectly fine without the existence of the ego. So is there really a you who's having all these conscious experiences? Or is the ego just an illusion? This brings us to the fourth big paradigm shift, the bundle theory of identity, founded by philosopher David Hume during the Enlightenment. Although, technically, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, beat him to it about 2,000 years earlier, with a very similar philosophy. As the name suggests, the bundle theory says that we're all placed in a kind of bundle of experiences, a grouping of conscious perceptions, which can change at any point throughout the day. While it does agree that we live out our lives in a chain of memory, it stresses that there's no actual ego that emerges from those memories. Under bundle theory, the ego is just a container, and only the thoughts themselves ever truly exist. Consciousness doesn't have a specific location in the brain, because consciousness is actually everywhere, even outside the human body. Animals are conscious, rocks are conscious, trees are conscious. So if everything is conscious, then what makes your consciousness special? It's still just a bundle of thoughts. Thoughts which come and go as they please, whether you like it or not. And you don't really have free will. You are not the one generating those thoughts, because those thoughts are predetermined. There's no ego, because there's no continuity of consciousness. According to Hume, our identity is not exactly permanent, and even consciousness can be interrupted by anesthesia, dreamless sleep, being knocked out, or just getting blackout drunk. Siddhartha called this anatta, or the non-self. the continuously evolving flow of awareness that we only really notice through meditation. For example, consider the hemispherectomy, a surgery where a person can actually survive having half their brain removed, and hypothetically, that other half could go on living if it was placed into a new body. So what if I cut Jack and Jill's brains in half, and then put Jack's left hemisphere inside Jill, and Jill's left hemisphere inside Jack? In that case, who would be who? If I took away 50% of your consciousness, then are you the same person? Yes? No? Well, what if I took 70% or 90% of your consciousness? This thought experiment debunks the idea that consciousness can somehow belong to someone. What David Hume and the Buddha were trying to tell us is that there's no clear point at which your consciousness goes from being one person to being another person. I clearly don't have the same consciousness that I had 5 minutes ago. For more evidence, look no further than the case of Phineas Gage, a laborer who took a railroad spike to the head. After the spike pierced his brain, he miraculously managed to survive, but the vessel containing his consciousness was not quite the same. This is evidenced by the fact that Gage used to be conscientious, polite, and a hard worker. But after the accident, he became irritating and short-tempered. So what's the big takeaway here? Well, the bundle theory essentially means that you don't have to worry about the loss of consciousness when uploading a mind. Because insofar as that uploaded mind is capable of holding thoughts, then it might as well be just as meaningful. Believe it or not, even the bundle theory has many unfounded assumptions. How exactly do we distinguish this bundle that we call the mind from any other possible mind in the universe? What if you were able to hook your mind up to another person's mind and then have the exact same thoughts at once? Would your identity disappear? Then there's the idea of the multiverse. An infinite number of copies of you that are thinking the exact same thing that you're thinking right now. Even if multiverse theory is wrong, there are still multiverses in our universe. The universe is an infinitely large place, and if you just travel 10 to the power of 87 light years in one direction, then statistical permutations of every particle in the observable universe suggest that you'll eventually bump into an exact same copy of the Earth, with the exact same copy of you, having the exact same thoughts. So overall, if anyone else can have the exact same thoughts you're having right now, there must be more to identity than just some bundle of experiences. These copies of you might be physically identical to you, but they are not metaphysically identical to you. This brings us to the psychological theory, or causality theory of personal identity, pioneered by philosopher Derek Parfit. Parfit argued that there's no reason that bodies, minds, consciousness, or thoughts should define our identity. If you were to cut your brain in half, and then place one half in a twin sibling, you would not be dead, unconscious, or unthinking. Maybe you would just become two people. Two bundles. What actually matters here is not consciousness or thoughts. What matters is the original person's causal relationship to the two new people who were created from them. To argue his theory, Parfit gives us the famous teletransportation paradox. Imagine that the transporter device from Star Trek actually existed for real. A machine that makes an exact copy of a person atom for atom, and destroys the original. While you're breaking someone down at the molecular level and vaporizing them, I suppose they're technically not dead because you made a new copy of them? So apparently that doesn't count as murder. Or does it? We assume that the copy and the original are the same person, because the copy doesn't feel like a copy, so it has no reason to complain. After all, if I can escape death and have a nice new body to slip into, I'm not really going to lose a lot of sleep wondering if I'm still technically me. However, Parfit notes that we should care, because the ontological nature of that copy matters more than you might think. Parfit's argument asks us to imagine the transporter machine scanning a person down to the last quantum state, copying all the information onto a beam of light, and then transmitting that beam of light to a facility on Mars. Once the information gets to Mars, another machine recreates you atom for atom, using the same organic stuff that you were composed of here on Earth. The person who wakes up on Mars will have the exact same memories, consciousness, and bundle of thoughts as you did. But the question is the transporter space travel or a death sentence? Which Commander Riker is more real? The original or the copy? Parfit says that even though both copies are exactly the same, our identity lies with the original, because there's no direct causal relationship between the original and the copy. The copy was only made by scanning the pattern of the original, and had nothing to do with the particles that composed the original. so the copy will thus not experience the original's subsequent interactions with the world. This metaphysical causality is what gives us our identity, regardless of how many multiverse copies we make. This is thanks to 17th century philosopher Gottfried Leibniz, who came up with a principle called the indiscernibility of identicals. Leibniz's law suggests that two things are identical only if they share all the same properties, and those properties also include a specific location in space-time, as well as a specific causal relation, which the teleported copy technically does not have. In fact, your multiverse copies are not technically you either, because they have different modal properties, such that you don't share the same possible world as they do. For Parfit, one thing is clear. The transporter from Star Trek is a suicide booth. You walk in, you get disassembled, and reassembled at the other end. But you have literally died in the process. So overall, what makes you unique as a person is your location in hyperspace, your causal history, and the psychological connectedness that brings it all together. You are you insofar as your current mental states were caused by previous mental states. This is what Parfit calls psychological connectedness, which is his condition for the persistence of identity. It was pretty popular in the 20th century, and many of Parfit's contemporaries came up with similar arguments on their own. Philosopher Peter von Inwagen asks you to consider that your son builds a tower out of Lego, asks you to show it to his mom, and then goes to sleep. Then suppose that you accidentally knock over the tower while cleaning, and you rush to put the blocks back in the exact same order. However, when your wife comes home and you say, "Look at what our son built," is that a true statement? Because the new structure doesn't have the same causal chain as being built by your son. It was built by you, and is thus not the same structure. The philosopher Donald Davidson's Swamp Man argument has a similar scenario. Imagine that you're walking in a swamp, and then are struck by a bolt of lightning. Your entire body is disintegrated, but at the very same moment, a second bolt of lightning strikes nearby, causing a bunch of molecules in the swamp to randomly arrange themselves into the exact same configuration you had before. By sheer chance, it makes a second copy of me. However, there's no causal relationship between the body destroyed and the body created. And the Swamp Man is really just what we'd call a Boltzmann brain, a mere circumstance of thermodynamics. So in a sense, you literally are your causality, at least at the quantum mechanical level. You are the sum of all quantum superpositions for every particle in your body, which is to say that an atomically identical copy of you could never be created in the first place. All in all, Parfit's theory of identity debunks the idea of mind uploading, because mind uploading would require you to collapse all quantum wave functions for every particle in the brain. But make no mistake, there's still a huge assumption being made here. Because if identity can be reduced to just material causality, then what's to stop us from conceptualizing an immaterial causality as well? After all, the information of those particles is not the same as the particles themselves, suggesting that your identity might actually be a list of numbers more than it is a clump of matter. If that's the case, then why is causality relevant? Why would it matter how a story is being told, as long as the story is told? There's still an immaterial causality between the body being disintegrated and the body being transferred to Mars. The information within the photons causes the new body to be formed. Perhaps all that really matters in the end is whether or not the teleported copy can be convinced that it's you. We have no empirical way of experiencing the difference between the original and the copy. So if we didn't know about the causality, how exactly would we tell which is which? Maybe the only part of identity that matters in the end is the story we tell ourselves. Maybe identity is just an interpretation, a narrative, a convincing myth we tell ourselves to help us sleep at night. The narrative theory, or power theory of identity, is a more postmodern theory that doesn't require any objective material notion of who you are. Because who you are is whatever you say you are, insofar as you can convince yourself and other people of that identity. The narrative theory was largely inspired by the work of philosopher Jacques Derrida, who didn't think any coherent meta-narrative of identity was even possible. Derrida defines the self as a constantly rewritten, reinterpretable text in relation to local contexts of difference. What Derrida found fascinating about language is that you can use it to talk about things that are not just present, but things that are absent. Even though I don't have a rocket here with me, nor can I point to one, we can still think about the same thing when I say the word rocket. Just saying the word rocket makes the concept appear in your mind. But Derrida thought there was something missing. Because when I say the word rocket, we're not necessarily thinking about the same rocket, unless we both understand what the word rocket means in relation to every other thing in the world. To know what a rocket is, you'd have to understand the cultural context. You'd have to know the difference between a car, a plane, a train, and a spaceship to know what a rocket is for. This same idea applies to identity. And since we can never have the full meaning of any concept present in your mind, then this means your identity is nothing more than a narrative, a construct. Meanings don't exist out there in the world. We project meaning onto the world. We can never really determine the full identity of anything, because we can never grasp our entire language in a single thought. So what your identity is means something different for everybody. The philosopher Daniel Dennett is one of the greatest defenders of the narrative theory. He compares identity to centers of gravity, a concept in physics that has no properties beyond its space-time location. Just like the center of gravity, a narrative is a kind of abstract theoretical fiction. The brain spins narratives about our lives, and those narratives become our identity. So maybe identity should be more of a creative process than a process of discovery. There's one big problem with all this though. In general, the biggest issue with the narrative theory is what we call the Napoleon problem. Consider that a delusional person claims to be Napoleon, but is not able to convince anyone that he is. So naturally, everyone rejects his narrative that he is Napoleon. But since narrative and identity are essentially equivalent, we'd technically be claiming that this person doesn't have an identity at all. What the Napoleon problem indicates is that there are people out there without identities, as if there's a kind of prior entity onto which narratives get tagged onto. Consider that I have two roses. Both the roses are red, both of them have thorns, and both are roughly the same shape. So exactly what is it that makes them different? Wouldn't a rose by any other name smell just as sweet? Perhaps we should be looking at identity less in terms of narratives, and more in terms of the potential to form narratives. The capacity to become different things. The narrative theory isn't too specific about individuation, because a narrative can actually change so much that it's no longer recognizable after a certain period of time. So if we accept this theory of identity, then we must also account for difference. This brings us to the haxiety, or difference theory of identity. The French philosopher Gilles Deleuze thinks the entire idea of a persistent personal identity is a huge linguistic mistake. Because all in all, the self is really just the sum total of our potentiality. He defines identity as simply the locus of movement image and time image, creating a certain set of potential affects. This capacity for transformation is referred to as a haxiety, or I-ness, a term originally coined by Duns Scotus, referring to the metaphysical entity onto which all these narratives get attributed to. Scotus disagreed with his contemporary, Thomas Aquinas, who thought individuation was material causality. However, this explanation failed to account for immaterial things like angels, consciousness, or the human soul. Scotus thought that there must be something more to individuation than just material arrangements, because otherwise, there'd be no difference between you and your freshly dead body. Perhaps individuation must also be related to potentiality. For instance, a live body having more potential than a dead body. Scotus believed that while we can't physically see haxieties, we can still infer their existence through what he calls intuitive cognition. But be careful not to confuse haxiety with the ego or self, because the ego or self is a narrative, and haxieties exist prior to that. A haxiety is the capacity for producing a subject. It's not the subject itself. This becomes important for Deleuze, who sees the entire universe as just one immanent thing he calls substance. And haxieties are really just the manifestation of difference within that substance. The haxiety is how we capture information about a system without needing to resort to organization or narratives. It's defined by its relation to things and how it can become those things. A thing actually exists before it has a narrative, and this is where all past theories of identity made a terrible mistake, because they seem to assume that we have some fundamental essence that makes us who we are. In Becoming Animal, one example he gives of a haxiety is a werewolf, which first has the identity of a human, but later gains the identity of a wolf, forming what you could call an assemblage. In the assemblage, both the man and the wolf cease to be subjects and become more of an event or a process than an actual thing. Changing essences is not something you are allowed to do in traditional conceptions of identity, but when we accept the idea that existence comes before essence, then suddenly identity isn't as big of a deal as we think it is. Because whenever you define the essence of something, I can always find an exception to the rule. If you define a Scotsman as a person who likes cold porridge, then I can always find you a Scotsman who doesn't like cold porridge. To which you can either respond by rejecting the essence of Scotsman, or by just telling me that this isn't a true Scotsman. According to Deleuze, a haxiety isn't defined by its essence. It's actually defined by what Deleuze calls latitude and longitude. The latitude of a haxiety is the total sum of non-subjectified material conditions, while the longitude is the haxiety's potentiality, the number of intensive affects that it's currently capable of. Difference comes before identity, and not vice versa. You can trace the problem all the way back to ancient Greece, with Plato and Aristotle's idea of particulars, things that have properties, and universals, which are the transcendent properties themselves, having their own separate existence in the so-called world of forms. Universals exist in the world of being, associated with the plane of organization, while particulars exist in the world of becoming, more associated with the plane of consistency. Now, to figure out what quote-unquote you actually are, we need to make a distinction between two core ideas: haxietism and quidditism. A haxiety is associated with particulars, the thisness of a thing. Examples of haxieties include Trumpness, Eiffel Towerness, or Keanu Reevesness. All particulars refer to a unique thing, regardless of how the properties of that thing change. Meanwhile, a quiddity is a universal, which is a thatness of your identity. Examples of quiddity include redness, largeness, or fastness. Under quiddities, a thing has no unique existence apart from its properties. Haxietism is the position that an entity has a set of principles that are unique to it and it alone, distinguishing the haxiety from everything else. Meanwhile, quidditism is the position that things don't exist apart from their properties, and the properties themselves exist on their own. Unlike the past theories of identity, which all evoke various forms of quiddities, like mind, body, thoughts, or consciousness, maybe we should try a theory focused on particulars, haxieties that are independent from their properties. However, we also shouldn't let identity become a kind of ball and chain, possibly keeping us from further improvement. In some sense, you could say that Deleuze is denying the existence of identity and just reducing it to immanent potentiality. As he says in his book, Difference and Repetition, individuation is not the individual. Instead of being formed by qualities, a haxiety is formed by singularities. Singularities are points within a haxiety that define it, but are not exclusive to it. For example, a grain of wood would be a singularity in the haxiety of a chair, while a carbon atom in that grain of wood would be a singularity in the haxiety of a grain of wood. Singularities aren't the properties of a haxiety, they're what generate those properties. Singularities respond to changes in fields and forces, giving rise to a thing's qualities without altering the uniqueness of the thing itself. This is to say that even if a mind uploading process creates a p-zombie, that p-zombie is still part of the same haxiety, it's just decreased in potential, because arguably, without consciousness, you're capable of fewer things. So that being said, maybe it's not the conservation of identity we should be concerned about. Maybe it's the conservation of potential. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the evolution of personal identity is a bad thing. After all, it's what allows for complex species like us to even exist. Suggesting that personal identity evolved as a genetic fitness adaptation, helping with resource acquisition, status garnering, and mate selection. The act of trying to preserve your identity is a perfectly understandable goal. However, we can't help but notice that evolution also favors organisms with increasing versatility in the face of selection pressure. In other words, it favors identities that become increasingly more malleable. You could call it the will to power, the will to potential, or self-overcoming. But whatever it is, evolution doesn't care about identity. It cares about how well a species can alter itself in the face of danger. To quote Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, it's not the strongest or most intellectual species that survives, but the one that's most adaptable to change. With that said, it seems like what we call the self reduces to a matter of adaptability. So maybe we should be less concerned with staying the way we are, and more concerned with how well we can change. Which conception of identity should a post-human society strive for? Well, Deleuze has another interesting idea called the body without organs, which can have many different manifestations, ranging from the Earth's molten core to a Mr. Potato Head. But another way to look at it is as a utopian civilization, a system in which our haxieties can be most easily destratified and deterritorialized into maximum potentiality. The body without organs can be accomplished with what we call technological posthumanism, having everyone on Earth entangle their haxieties into a more interconnected assemblage. We might end up like the Borg from Star Trek, but if that ever happens, I hope that it would grant the members of this hive mind more agency and more interchangeability than they had in the show. the quickest way to get to the BWO is by creating what's called a rhizome, a system where every person is connected to every other person, and also has no center. Take note that the internet is not a rhizome. A rhizome society would be less like the internet and more like, say, the Zerg from StarCraft, the Replicators from Stargate, or the Geth from Mass Effect. Given enough time to evolve, these rhizome societies could definitely become a body without organs. And if you equate your identity with potential, then this is definitely a system you can look forward to. It all depends on what you want. In the end, your identity is meaningful if it means something to you, and that's what we've come to realize. In summary, these are the 7 most popular theories of identity. But this entire discourse on what you are and what you are not leads us to a very interesting conclusion, that when it comes to identity, maybe we shouldn't sweat the small stuff. Granted, there are less popular theories, like achievement theory, where we are what we've achieved, or experience theory, where we are what we've experienced. But these theories are more suited to social media narcissists than they are to futurists. Identity was always more of an ever-changing process than a static thing, and maybe it's not as big of a deal as we think it is. Perhaps we've been thinking of identity in the wrong way altogether. We're thinking about it as something that needs to be discovered rather than something we ourselves joyfully create. So maybe we should spend less time debating identity and more time developing the technology that would let us change our identity. Which brings us to neurotechnology. Whether you're a person or a machine, you'll still have a haxiety, and whether that haxiety is lost due to mind uploading is not something you should lose too much sleep over. Maybe what you should really be worried about is if you're taking a form with more potential or less potential. So just don't go transferring your mind into a toaster, and you'll probably be fine. So with all this information now available to you, maybe you too should start asking yourself the big questions. Who are you? And what do you want?